Why should they dolled-up, niminy-piminy loobies be allowed to take the bread out the mouths of our children? They gentry fishes for pleasure only, while us does so for a living. Aye, 'tis true. They can fish in March, when the big run of fish be coming in, but us chaps has to wait till April. 'Tidn't right. They stops the nets in March, when the fish be running plentiful, so that salmon can get up the rivers for to provide sport for the rich man. If salmon spawn in autumn, there's plenty of soldiers running up then, red as mullets, to keep the stock going. Red hake, you mean, don't you, Bob Kift? Aye, red hake us has to call 'em, like hypocrites in the close season, else us would be fined or sent to jail if they water bailies had their way. And I'll tell you this, my dear, for to put through your magic lantern when you'm showing it off to the gentry what sits on the bench. Ask they magistrates what fines poor men for poaching, as they calls it, ask they niminy-piminy water whippers if their cooks have ever bought red hake at the back door for the gentry to sit at their tables and eat at night. Why, if they had their deserts, they'd all be in jail. That's my question to your answer, Doctor. And the bull seal sat down. The mission hall was in an uproar of laughter and shouts, of stamped feet and rolling heads. The doctor was a man of courage, which may be the same thing as obstinacy at times. When the laughter had subsided a little and they were waiting for more fun, he said, "Ah, Bob Kift, you ought to be on the board with your eloquence. But now let's be serious a moment. If all the fish are caught before they can spawn, your living as well as the river fishing will simply die out. You are agreed about that, surely? Come now." "'Tidn't true, you know," intoned a solemn voice. They looked round at the figure of William Crang, the preacher, who had risen on his feet. The audience at once settled quieter. They preferred Bob Kift to speak for them, but let a man have his say, and from what they knew of Julius Caesar, his say would be something. "I have something to say," said the solemn voice. Aye, it was coming, trust Julius Caesar. "The Lord put the fish into the sea, no man can deny that, during the creation of the earth in 6 days. Fish were created for the food of men, can anyone deny that?" "What about seals and herring hogs?" cried a voice from the back of the room. "I am concerned with the truth of the book, and let no man deny it except at the peril of his immortal soul and the chance to everlasting damnation." Julius Caesar looked around. All eyes avoided his eyes. "Well, then, since no man can deny the truth, I can illustrate what we have heard tonight by bringing to you the miracle of the loaves and fishes, which the book—" But the man who had mentioned seals and herring hogs, otherwise porpoises, did not appear to have any respect for William Crang. He interrupted the threatened sermon by calling out, "Let they as be saved or think they are save their voices for Sundays. Meanwhile, why don't the board shift they rocks below Middle Ridge? If they profess to be serving the interest of the working man, why don't they clear away the rocks? Shall I tell you why? Because they care nothing for the workers, though they pretend to, like all capitalist hypocrites. It be a bourgeois swindle to keep down the workers' revolution. Lenin said—" "Us don't want no red flag here, my dear," cried Bob Kift, getting on his feet. "All the same, Doctor, there be some sense in getting the board, if they'm a mind to it, to dredge up they rocks, which tears the seines of our nets time and time again." "Now, Doctor, us nosy, but with all respect, you bain't very old, my dear, and some on us chaps have been yours season after season 60 years and more. You'll do more good if you ask the board to shift they rocks, but they won't tackle it, and shall I tell you for why? Because they want netsmen to have broken nets, for to let the fish through, for their pals on the riverside up along to get the fish." The noise of agreement was terrific. The meeting seemed to be out of control. Vainly the doctor's voice cried out that the board had no money to undertake the work, that if the men wanted to do it, why didn't they do it themselves? The board wasn't all-powerful. It merely tried to preserve the stock of fish for year after year. They went out noisily to the pubs. Nothing, apparently, had been achieved by the good intentions of the doctor. When we were alone in the room, he said to me, "You won't get any objective thinking from men who still believe in such palpable superstition as the crake." I agreed with the doctor. Obviously, they were as prejudiced as the limpets on the rocks. In the Royal George, I heard old masts and yards declaring that salmon did not spawn in the rivers. In his father's time and grandfather's before him, he said, fish spawned on the gravel of the Middle Ridge, which some called Schwa's Hook, since Captain Charles Hook had been drowned there in his young days by the crake, but Middle Ridge was allers the proper name. The old man's son, Whistling Paddy, sat beside him. I avoided speaking to him. I felt that he was shy of speaking, for he could not articulate his words properly, his jaws having been set askew after being broken by the torpedo explosion which had preceded the burning in petrol flames. Also, the ear of anyone he was confiding in was liable to be sprayed by a whistle of beer. The trend of the talk was that someone had got at the doctor, someone on the board, and sucked him in. That was the only explanation, for he was a nice little fellow who paid his way and harmed no man by either word nor deed. The lecture was the subject of much talk that night. But by the following week, when the season was opened, something was reported which put nearly everything else from their minds. The crake had been heard by 3 boat crews fishing from the Schwa's Hook in the darkness. It was no exaggeration, it was a fact. A dozen men told me that they had heard it quite clearly in the darkness. The doctor laughed at the story. I did not know what to think. Meanwhile, I was learning more about the art of salmon fishing. The tides ruled when the netsmen could fish. Once every day and once every night, the lunar Atlantic pulse moved up the estuary, filling the arms of the 2 rivers. The sea went up far beyond the old bridges of Barnstaple and Bideford, pressing back the fresh waters of the moorland rivers. And at the tide heads, at the very end of ocean's impulse, the flow hesitated and became the ebb. Unless there was enough water in the rivers for the fish to run up further, they returned with the tide, to come back again in the following flow. Each journey up and down the estuarine reaches was perilous for the salmon, for when the tide was making, and again when it was nearly ebbed away, the boats went from their moorings below the sea wall, each with its crew of 4, to take salmon and peel in nets 200 yards in length, each with a mesh of 2 inches, the size determined by law to permit the escape of immature fish. It so happened that on the day of my next visit, it was the turn of the boat owned by Whistling Paddy and skippered by his father, out of courtesy to the old man, to start the morning's fishing upon the sandbank of the dangerous shoal called the South Tail. The licensed boats of the estuary took turns at the various fishing places, so that all should have an equal chance. So the boat, skippered by old masts and yards, its number painted on its bows according to the law, left its moorings below the Royal George in advance of the other boats, and went down upon the massive green and wimpling glide of the ebb. It was a spring tide. The moon was new. The weight of incoming press of water had made the currents the fastest of the month. The ebb was equally rapid. It swilled along down to the north and south tails, marked by their successive lines of the dreaded white water. With placid dips of sweeps, the boat drifted down on the tide, passing a leaning buoy on which was perched a herring gull with 1 leg. The bird was waiting for the water to lapse, for the wide expanse of the middle ridge to show itself. Then it would fly by custom thither, prize off mussels with its beak, carry them into the air, drop them on the stones below, and follow them down to eat out of the smashed shells. The pitiless yellow eye of the bird stared at the old sailor, sitting on the piled net at the stern, who saw it without a thought. Sometimes a wave, driven by the west wind, slapped against the bows of the boat, and skits of water were flung into it. Soon the buoy, marking the edge of the fairway, was left behind. A mile and more seawards, waves were breaking on the tails of the bar with a dull and ceaseless roar. Beyond, in the bay, a tramp steamer was lying at anchor, awaiting the iron ball on the post by the lighthouse in the sandhills to arise, a sign that the bar was navigable. The ship would have to wait several hours for high water. To left of the salmon boat was a ridge of grey pebbles, above which were low cliffs of sand, worn by wind, the ragged dunes held by marram grasses. This was the Westward Ho Pebble Ridge, made famous by Kipling in Stalky & Co. The old man looked without interest at the long, bleak stretch of sand. His mind was far away, perhaps looking upon scenes of the South Atlantic, the green slopes of Peru, the immense, towering Andes, flushing pink in the sunrise which had not yet looked upon the topsails of the three-masted schooner, whose holy-stoned decks he trod with his wooden shoon. He had worn these as a lad on returning to port the first time after rounding the Horn, the first time he had known the exhilaration of the trade winds. The 16-foot salmon boat passed by the hurly-burlies, uncovering in the lapsing water, their black edges ripping white. It passed the checkered pulling buoy, floundering in the hollow swirl of waters. But still the old man was away in thought and fancy. Only when a salmon leapt out of a wave not 50 yards from the boat, followed by a big black object, and at the shout of "Erinog" from one of the rowers, did his eyes focus upon the moment, to see the porpoise rolling up and down again like a blubbered bottle. There were others farther off. "'Tidn't right to allow them, I say," said one of the rowers. "There'll be several on 'em. They'm taking of the fish, you know, all the time. If the water bailies would do some work with a rifle out here sometimes, there'd be some sense to it." There was a school of porpoises. They had followed a run of salmon from the Lundy race a dozen miles and more westward from the bar. Several salmon leapt to escape the predaceous mammals, each of which would tear away its bite from a fish, then pursue another. They were hunting not from hunger, but for sport. The sight of many dark shapes rolling up and under again filled each man with hatred. The sweeps ceased to ply as they watched. It seemed that there were at least a dozen porpoises in the school. Another rolled up just behind the stern of the boat. In its mouth was pink flesh and a glint of silvery scales, together with the fin torn from near the salmon's vent. In his anger, old masts and yards spat at it, squirting brown tobacco juice at it, his only weapon of offence. When his anger had gone, he said, "There be fish about, so pull hard, lads. They'm running. I never seed so many lepping like this in all my born days." Whistling Paddy hissed with excitement. The boat went down towards a spit of sand, on which gulls, white in the sunshine, rushing before and after the shadows of clouds, were perched head to wind. The starboard sweep was eased, the sandbank grew nearer. When, with a slight bump, the keel show grazed the sand, Whistling Paddy jumped out, and a coil of rope was flung to him. Winding the end round his waist, he shoved out the boat again, and at once it was rowed with long, strong pulls into the current. The old man paid out the rope over the stern, and then the net followed, the dark 200 yards of it, 8 feet deep, corked along its head rope and leaded at the heel. The heel rope sank away immediately, leaving the corks on the choppy surface to hold the net vertical. The cast was made on the shape of a horseshoe, and by the time all of the net had dropped over the stern, the ankle boots of Whistling Paddy, leaning back on the rope, were sunken in wet sand beyond their tops. He tugged them free, and with all his strength began to plod along the waterline towards the boat, which, having come round its loop against the tide, had touched into the bank again. The 3 men clambered out. One ran to join Whistling Paddy, whose head was bowed, for the pull of the tide on the net was almost beyond his strength. Clouds covered the sun. The second man bent the dark and dripping net over his shoulder, and together they slowly plodded towards the other pair, likewise hauling. When about 30 paces apart, they stopped and began to pull hand under hand slowly, the short, slow pulls against the weight of water which had crushed the horseshoe shape and borne the seine past the idle boat. Minute after minute the 4 men hauled unspeaking, 2 at the head rope, 2 at the heel rope. The dull morning grew lighter. The waves were washed with tinny sunlight. The porpoises were now around the distant bar buoy. As the distorted arc of the corks was drawn imperceptibly smaller, hauling was easier. When only the purse remained in the sea, the bodies of the men were bent forward and they hauled rapidly, the net falling at their feet, while their eyes stared for the sight of fish. The purse, drawn in fast, was empty, except for green crabs and stones with bladderweed growing on them. No word was spoken. The youngest man ran away to the boat and started to pull it to the piled net. His mate ran to help him. "They herring hogs have drove the fish out again, I reckon." They walked the boat up in the shallow water. In the meantime, the old man and his son, one at heel and t'other at head rope, were shaking the net free of stone and crab, crushing crabs underfoot, and piling the net on the sand, preparatory to repiling it upon the boat's stern. Afterwards a rest of a couple of minutes while they gazed seawards for sign of jumping fish. Nothing. But the press of the tide was lessening, and at a word from the skipper a second draught was shot. Once again the shedding of the net, the full strength pulling on the heavy sweeps, the slow plodding haul from the sandbank, the emerging, after 20 minutes, of the purse. Again only crabs and seaweed and insignificant flatfish shaken free. No cursing of luck after the vain fatigue of labour which made the backs of the recently unemployed men, unused to such work, painful to straighten again. Again the youngest went for the boat, again the piling and repiling of the net, and when the third draught was shot and hauled in as before, the tide was slack and almost at once began to flow. Wind was freshening, flinging afar sprays from the tops of combers before they curled and plunged in bounding white turmoil upon the hidden shoals of the bar. The tide began to move in faster, creeping up the sandbank. A large bird flew with powerful thrusts of wings up the estuary, settling with a splash beside the pulling buoy. "He knows where the fish be, I reckon," said one of the amateur netsmen. The skipper did not reply. He was afraid of shoaling water. White water was death to all deep-water sailors. So the salmon boat left the bank for the lighthouse shore, where the 4th draught of the day was shot. The porpoises was seen nearer in the fairway, heading for the place the boat had left. One of the new men grumbled. He glanced as he hauled now and again at the black bird near the pulling buoy, tipping up and disappearing under water and swimming with rapid thrusts of its webbed feet. The shag caught 2 codling and a sea trout, returning to the surface with each fish to tip it head first into its hooked beak before gulping it down. After each swallowing and before the succeeding tip-up and dive, its small emerald eyes stared at the men, its enemies, across the widening gulf of water. "There be fish over yonder," said the youngest man to his mate. "Don't waste your breath, lad, save it for hauling," said the skipper. "I could have made more on the Dole this last month had I known it," replied the other. A fish leapt inside the arc of the corks, a big un. In silent intentness the purse of the net was drawn in, and there was the salmon threshing upon the watery shingle. "Steady, lad!" Whistling Paddy got his hand round the wrist of the fish by the tail, and, securing his grip, lifted it sinuating up the shingle, where he dropped it to thump it on the base of the skull with a sodden length of driftwood. £15, I reckon, father." £15 at 2 shillings a pound from the agent, the boat builder who collected fish for the lorry which came from Bristol to meet every tide, 30 shillings. That was something, but they would have to take many more fish before the license and wear of boat and net was paid for, let alone their living. After another draught, there was danger of the tide taking the net among the rocks lying off the shingle shore, so they rowed up tide to the Schwarzhoek ridge. They rowed hard to get into the fairway. The tide was tumbling over the low rocks, but they reached the pulling buoy in safety, and from there approached rapidly the lower end of the bank. Behind them, between ridge and lighthouse, the tide was leaping and pouring. On a rock raised above the others squatted the black bird, with wings half spread and a fish-tail sticking out of its gullet. It moved its wings at the elbows in order to shake down into its crop the live eel, which was trying to writhe a way out of the scalding juices of the crop past a flatfish and a small bass, both fish inert but still breathing. The shag's crop was gorged. The outheld wings eased the weight. "That bloody bird picks up a living easy," complained the youngest man. "The bloody thing ought to be shot." There was no need to do more than paddle in the fairway to keep control of the boat with the tide flowing fast. There was time for one more draught only. Amid the chop of wavelets that broke irregularly with foamy tops, with bubbles rushing under, the open boat glided past the decreasing extent of the Schwarzhoek at 5 knots. The wooden props which shored the gravel barges, while gravel had been dug and shovelled on board at low tide, had been taken aboard the squat, tarred vessels. Frothy flumes of water were pouring into the pits beside the barges, rocking the matchsticks flung away by the men at work as they had lit their fags. Now the gravel diggers were resting. Smoke wandered forth from galley chimneys. A heron flew across the pool with heavy, hollow flight, making for the duck ponds in the marshes behind the sea-wall. "One more draught, lads. The tide be making fast." They shot the draught, while other boats coming in from the bar passed over their floating corks. The salmon boats swept by, making for the backwash or eddy which lay off the curve of the sea wall. It was hard work hauling in the net against the pull of the tide, and under water the heel rope was carried against the big rocks on the bed of the pool. The net was hung up. It had to be pulled free, for now time was against the crew. As they hauled, it was seen that at least 6 salmon were on the right side of the corks. The fish drove about to find a way out of the net. Their back fins reamed along the top of the water and caused some excitement among the 2 amateur fishermen. Visions of much money at the weekend made their eyes keen, but the skipper and his son, whom the seas had taught patience, hauled stoically as before. One fish rushed unseen towards the edge of the gravel, turning in a great boil of sand and water, and sped back, the sounds of its acceleration being just audible as a drumming or thruddling through the noises of pouring water. It was a big sea trout. They hauled in, but when the seine came into near water, and finally upon the gravel, it was empty, a hole torn in the purse. Then the skipper dropped his rope, and raising his fist to the sky began to curse the water bailies for not dredging up they flamin' hellerin' rocks instead of trying to stop honest men after a lifetime of work on the high seas from keeping out of the grubber, workhouse or poorhouse, by turning an honest penny. They dald, blaspheming, bored buggers mocked Holy Writ, and they water bailies were disciples of Satan himself. His words were heard by Julius Caesar, skipper of another boat, as it moved past the ridge. "Taking the holy book's name in vain won't never pay you, my dear," came the warning from the bulky, solemn-faced man. "You watch what you'm about. You a mast and yards man and all. You ought to know better than take the book's words in vain." "Go and cork yourself, you psalm-singing hellfire traitor of a bloody boy, you longshore beachcombing son of a ship's cat." Julius Caesar was a mere 50 years of age, 30 years younger than masts and yards. "You should know better at your age than to talk like that, my dear," called back the other, in the boat rapidly receding upon the making tide. The current took it past the pool buoy, leaning at a steep angle upstream, a plume of water flung over its top. "Aye, you should know better, old man. God is not mocked," came over the water. The stentorian tones had been heard by several of the crews of the gravel barges, waiting on the Schwarz Hook for the tide to float them off and take them up to the ports of Bideford and Barnstaple. Some men looking on laughed with derision. Because of his known hardness for money, Krang was not popular, but he thought they derided not himself or his manner, but the word, so he felt he was fighting the good fight. Old Masts and Yards growled and spat as he repiled the torn net, muttering to himself about a local preacher who had never been beyond shoaling water. The younger men, the ex-soldiers, were amused and superior, winking to one another at the nonsense of old men, both so daft as each other. But even they, sceptical of so much since their return home from the war, were quietened when, only a little more than 12 hours later, they recalled the preacher's words. The crake came again, in the darkness, this time with death. Towards midnight, old Masts and Yards got out of bed where he'd been sleeping partly clothed, awoke his son, and went downstairs in his socks. After a cup of strong hot tea and some bread and beef dripping, the two put on several extra garments, all frayed and worn, jersey, waistcoat, trousers, jacket, which had been hanging to dry on a line across the ceiling. Clad thus against the cold night air, they left Ursha Court, each carrying a sweep, which had been brought up from the boat during the afternoon tide, lest they be stolen. Tiny bluish-yellow jets of light marked the set-stone streets and broad quay, beside which black masts and rigging of coastal craft arose among the stars. The night was almost silent, with faint slappings and murmurs of the ebb tide on boat and mooring and wet steps of slips. On the farther shore, lights shone in unseen houses, their thin reflections wriggling like golden eels beyond shapes of darkest shadow which were the moored salmon boats. Father and son, unspeaking, waited by a bollard to which the rope of a quayside ketch was made fast. At last voices were heard. A red spark came nearer, with the sounds of shuffling, soft footfalls, of boots worn to the uppers. Without a word, the four men went down the wet stone slip to the rocks and sand, hauled in their boat by the dripping painter, then away down on the ebb by the spinning sea-top of the pool buoy, and so to the dark, rising ridge of the Schwarz Hook, now musical with the cries of wading birds. At steady intervals, the roving beam of the lighthouse caressed the boat, and lit in a frail flash the outlines of gravel barges anchored there for the tidal shift. There was money to be made in gravel. Government subsidies to builders for new houses were £260 a house, and many an ugly little square building was going up, built by men who were one-man builders, masons seizing their chance to get on and make money. Gravel, sharp Two Rivers gravel, after washing in fresh water to remove the salt, made the best mortar. Hoarse, human tones came from the water-lapped dark of the Schwarz Hook, followed by the thud of wood balks and the crush of boots on wet shell fragments and stones, as sleepy men jumped after the props to shore upright their barges. A blot of intense light swept over the ridge, stared blindingly a moment on the dark scene, blinked into darkness, and leapt again into seaward shine of vigilance, clear and unfaltering for 30 seconds. Distantly came the roar of the waves on the bar. The two men dipped the sweeps to keep steering way on the boat. Flashes of phosphorescence glimmered green, and died in every placid swirl left by the blades. Old Masts and Yards and his son sat aft, the piled seine between them. In silence the boat glided away, leaving behind the ridge and the lonely lighthouse among the sandhills. Past the pulling buoy, writhing heavily ahead of the racing troughs and crests of the tide on the rocks, the dreaded hurly-burlies, and down the fairway to the loose sandbank near the south tail. The water flickered with the pale green lights of phosphoric plankton, minute life of the summer sea. There was little wind, the air was heavy with moisture, and rain began to fall as they were shooting the first draft. At first a soft drizzle, then a steady, suant wetness, which laid the thin clothes of the ex-servicemen against their bodies. They did not mind being wet. Their minds held memories of hopeless, cold nights and days in the flooded winter crater zones of Somme and Ypres, which kept them fortified, in that they thought of the roof over their heads when they should return, where they were safe, secure, where they could be warm, and to which they might go and come at will. So they toiled without loss of spirit, in darkness that might have been water, except that it could be breathed. After slow heaving, they heard something in the purse, and pulling in the net were disappointed to find within, threshing and flacking, squat fish with thin rasping tails and heavy angular bodies, nearly flat. "Thornbacks!" one man cried in disgust. Whistling Paddy sought a Swedish knife from his pocket, flicked open the single blade, and stabbed the two great fish many times to sever the spinal cords. They were skate. On their backs were bony talons. They shone palely as they were lifted up to be slithered into the well of the boat. Of little value, parts of the fish were used in the fish and chip shop, poor men's food. The crew waited for the ebb to slacken. When the tide was low, the skipper made another cast, but instead of rowing round and hauling in directly, he told the two men at the sweeps to linger in the fairway, with the net gently bellied by the tide just on the make. This was illegal. It prevented fish from ascending. The net became a fixed engine for the taking of salmon, thus, in both theory and practice, stopping fish from reaching the nets higher up. The salmon either were not running or were remaining over the bar, afraid of the porpoises which had been seen several times during the day. Some of them had gone up with the previous tide, almost to the town's bridges. At any rate, the net was empty. The skipper made one more cast, then he left, afraid of shoaling water, ever mindful of the dreadful menace of white water. The boat went up to the next place. Here they took 2 salmon and were jubilant. 2 grilse of only about 9 pounds, but they were fish, and made 3 that day. "There'll be a school coming in, I reckon." They hastened to the repiling of the net, for the skipper said that they would best ways cast from the lower end of the ridge. There were no loose rocks in the fairway at that place. It had taken him and his son 3 hours to repair the torn purse. It was from the lower end of the Schwarz hook that the last cast of the little company of 4 was made, before the boat was sold. The tragic circumstances of that final draft were discussed for many weeks, even months afterwards. While Whistling Paddy held the rope on the ridge, his figure silhouetted now and again by the sweeping beams of the lighthouse, the boat pulled across the tide, while being carried aslant the drift of water. It was turning round in a wide arc amidst its own wake of phosphorescence, the rowers straining at the sweeps to bring the boat back quickly to the ridge, when a big salmon, thought to be all of 40 pounds, leapt from the water and fell with a splash only a few feet away from the skipper in the stern. As he called to the rowing men to bend their backs, a hissing noise, accompanied by a tremendous downpour, made him peer into the gloom. "Keep you a-going, lads, keep you a-going," he called out. Almost immediately afterwards, a scream, strange and plaintive, seemed to be coming from the agitated water beside the boat. The upheaval was so severe that the boat was violently rocked. Water poured over its starboard gunwale. One of the rowers lost his sweep and fell over backwards. The other swore in his fear. "Keep you a-going, lads," said the skipper. A dim white patch arose out of the murk. The sea became lashed with foam, filled with green flecks of fire, and the moaning scream came again, arising out of the turmoil and filling all with terror. Others heard the noise. There was a shout from way up the ridge of, "The Crake!" Whistling Paddy on shore was yelling. His words were indistinct, but it was thought he cried that he was not able to hold the rope. At the same time, the net was being hauled off the stern sheets of the boat by something big in the water. Seeing what was happening, one of the rowers clambered aft and grabbed the rope coiled under the remaining bulk of the net, now leaping off the boat into the water. The old man began to curse him. "Get you back to the thole-pins, you loopy, or I'll have you in irons afore us be finished." The younger man took no notice as he took a couple of turns round his sweep. "Don't get the wind up, Dad," he said. "Us will lose the net else. 'Tis a school of mullet. I seen 'em in Cork Harbour in bloody thousands." "Leave me to mind the net. Get you back to the sweep, you girt fool, you!" cried the skipper. The man had hardly got back to his thwart when the cries on shore changed into yelps of distress. "I can't hold it no longer. I can't hold it further," came Paddy's voice faintly. "All right, boy, us be coming. Keep you a hold, us be coming," cried the old man. The rope end in the boat was still turned round the handle of the sweep. The boat was drifting fast with the tide, though seemingly still. The man who held the sweep placed it between the oaken pins and braced himself to hold it there, for the rope was now snaking over the gunwale, giving little leaps and slashing the surface of the water. He braced himself for the tug to come. The skipper was by now without speech. He had no power left to compel the mutinous man to do his bidding. To row ashore to help his boy, whom he already saw in a moment of insight as lost. A deep-water man, a masts and yards sailor for 50 years, he knew what the spouting of water portended. He had seen monsters of the deep ocean main. But in his very experience, by his knowledge of the ways of God upon the face of the waters, he was helpless. For only the old knew the truth, and nobody listened to an old un. When the rope had run out of the boat, the jerk on its beam was so heavy that it almost capsized. Then the boat was being turned about as it was pulled sideways, its gunwale almost under water. "Loose the rope! Loose it, you!" cried the other man. His mate responded by tipping up the sweep so that it slid overboard. The boat was now free. Other shouts were coming from the darkness. The cries of whistling Paddy had ceased. When the old man found his voice, he called out, "Be all right, Paddy boy?" And when there was no reply, he stood up, took the other sweep, and putting it over the stern, began to scull towards the ridge, working it to and fro with a rolling motion. The two men sat still on the thwarts, and the bump into the shore of the Schraz Hook near the barges, now waiting to go home on the tide after the night's work, flung them on their backs among the cold and slippery skates. Old Masts and Yards walked down the ridge calling to his son. There was no answer. A hailing voice from beyond the barges cried out that there was something beating about in the pool. Another voice was heard. "'Tis the vengeance of the Lord come among sinners. 'Tis the Lord's wrath come among us." It was the voice of William Crang. The old man went down the length of the Schraz Hook, calling the name of his son. The two men stood dejectedly by the boat. The net was gone. There would be no seeing that again. They would have to find other work. Rain was falling lightly. The rotating beam of the lighthouse was an opaque blur. From the quay across the water, one or two women who had heard the shouting and thought it might be trouble with the water bailiffs watched in the darkness. The mournful hail of old Masts and Yards came over the water. As the onlookers waited, they saw an insignificant light burning upon the ridge. They watched it wavering about like a will-o'-the-wisp before it fell and died out. "Oh, my God, what be that, my dear? Did he see him, sure enough?" "'Tis trouble, I shouldn't wonder. Maybe 'tis they water bailies." The flare had been burned by Crang, whose practice it was to enwrap himself with newspapers at night under his jersey as a protection against wet and cold. Now, like a pictured prophet of old, except for his bulk and girth, which certainly did not accord with any fasting in the wilderness, he was advancing down the southern shore of the Schwarzhoek, bearing aloft a torch of rolled newspapers in one hand, while with the other he pulled more paper from around his middle. "Brothers," he chanted to the night out of a feeling of self-justified joy, "brothers, fellow sinners all, the wages of sin is death, and he who taketh the Lord's name in vain shall be in danger of everlasting hell-fire." He waved the burning newspapers. Other boats were appearing on the waterline of the ridge. One was rowing hard against the tide, a man in the bows, standing up and looking for sign of floating corks. Men gathered round William Crang. The feeble flare, with an occasional spark fleeting down towards the coppery crescent moon low in the vapours of the west, revealed their quiet faces. Stealthily the water crept up the sloping bank. From the direction of the lighthouse came a rushing roar as the sea poured into the rocky pools and lagoons below the distant shingle shore. The men discussed what had happened. The net had been torn away from the boat, that was certain. As for Paddy on shore, the rope enwound about his middle and over his shoulder, and held by a half-hitch, as was his habit, had pulled him into the water. The boat crew at the top of the ridge had heard his feeble cries in the water, following a great shower of spray and the slashing plunge of some fish or animal. "'Tis no use for us to strive with a man's reason," intoned Julius Caesar. "What be the Lord's hidden purpose, no man can dispute. 'Tis the crake come again, for to warn sinful man, animated by their own pride, which goeth before a fall, for to teach us sinners all to live humbly in the ways of the Lord." "Put a sock in it," muttered one of the ex-service men, but the words were unheard in the general response of "Amen." Boats searched in the chill light of the descendant moon up the courses of the two rivers until dawn, looking for floating corks which would reveal the net. They had little hope of finding the missing man alive. They searched as an act of reverence to themselves and to their neighbours to bring the body home for the churchyard. That was the natural place of a man when he was cut off, to be laid to rest in the place where he was born, where there was love for him, surely lingering in the stones he had known, in the faces of friends and comrades, and most of all in the heart of his father. That is how it seemed to me when I learned the story of Masts and Yards, and found out why, so often in sunny weather and rainy times too, he was to be seen by the war memorial. Had not all his sons been lost at sea? His neighbours knew it, and so they searched for the boy, Paddy, to bring him home to his father. The boats which searched until dawn found nothing. One volunteer crew kept a lookout during the ebb, but saw nothing of the net. The mystery remained for another day, and, as has been said, provided the only real topic of talk in the village and its 17 taverns and inns, until the matter became clear the following morning. The mystery remained for another day, and, as has been said, provided the only real topic of talk in the village and its 17 taverns and inns, until the matter became clear the following morning. The pilot of the Lundy boat Larina, going out on the top of the tide, saw something floating near the bar buoy. Standing in nearer, he saw what were apparently the corks of the missing net. The ropes were twisted round the chain to which the buoy was anchored. The Larina heaved to, and a boat hook caught the head rope. Hauling part of the net aboard, they recovered the body of Whistling Paddy, distended with water. It was even as had been said. The rope was made fast to his chest by 2 turns secured by a half-hitch. It was drawn tight, confirming the belief that he had been pulled at a considerable pace through the water. The Larina turned back to where on the quay a stretcher on wheels was waiting, for the boat had been watched from the lighthouse, the keeper of which had telephoned to the police in the village and to the doctor. The body, covered by a canvas, was taken off in a rowing boat, after which the Lundy packet prepared to encounter the formidable tide sweeping down the Irish Sea into the open Atlantic, set her sails to aid the efforts of the oil engine which drove the screw. On her way across Bideford Bay, the captain of the Larina saw ahead a school of porpoises. They were not rolling and leaping through the sea in the usual manner of herring hogs. Indeed, when the captain of the Larina looked through his glass, he saw that one was jumping in the manner of a salmon trying to escape the pursuit of seal or porpoise. The porpoises, about a score of them, were appearing in all directions, quite unlike a school following a leader in a drive after food. The porpoises were being pursued. Suddenly he saw what was after them. An immense shape arose out of the water, a little whale, which opened its wide mouth set with teeth like tent pegs to snap at, but to miss its prey, before diving down again and showing a fluked tail as it disappeared. The Larina kept on her course, which would cross that of the line of porpoises. The next time the monster appeared, it was with a porpoise being champed in its jaws, which were red with blood. The killer's head was blunt, shining, smooth, and black, with 2 patches of white above and behind its 2 small eyes. From a spiracle in the top of the head, a jet of vaporous water rose hissing. It was a killer whale, a carnivorous animal which fed on flesh and fish alike. In companies, the killers sometimes attacked the largest sperm whales, springing at the vast flippers to tear away flesh, with chop of jaws able to crush seal or man with equal ease. Orca gladiator, the grampus. So that was the origin of the crake. Well, not exactly the origin, for the screaming cries in the night had probably been made by a seal in its death agonies. The grampus had followed the porpoises and seals up the estuary, themselves following the runs of salmon, and, coming up against the net, had simply carried it away. Such was its weight that, had it chanced to arise under a 16-foot salmon boat, it could have overturned it and scarcely been checked in its movement through air and water. Whistling Paddy was buried by the vicar, himself an old naval chaplain with traditional ritual and discipline. The net was recovered, torn in the middle, and sold. So was the boat. Old masts and yards continued to live in Ursha Court, and the last time I saw him was as the first. He was standing in the sunshine by the War Memorial. I knew then that he was there to be near his sons. In his thoughts he saw them and talked to them. They were all ages to him, from small children to grown youths. He told their ghosts about the youngest, little Paddy. He saw their mother with them, too, she who had died when they were children, so that they were brought up while he was away for months at a time, sailing the deep waters of the 7 seas, by a sister of his, who now lay in the churchyard. One day they would all be together again. The good book said so. He had always believed it to be true, although he had never wanted any man, certainly not one like Willem Crang, to tell him so. Until they should all meet again, there was work to be done. "A man must splice a rope," he said. And now I understood the meaning, the experience behind the simple phrase. This man had lived by courage all his life in the perils of the sea, and until his own final dissolution, he would continue that way. The next story is called A Hero of the Sands. A dogfight is always stimulating, usually interesting, occasionally amusing, rarely dangerous. Once, on the summer sands, in the glorious days of wearing a beard, a shirt, trousers tied up with string, and shoes without socks, I came upon a very funny scene. There before me was a Pekingese dog, hanging to the lower part of one section of a visitor's trousers. I was prepared to enjoy myself to the full for the sight the gods had provided, when my mood of detached amusement changed. The action looked to be complicated, for while the embarrassed fellow was trying to knock away the little beast with a newspaper, a big Alsatian wolfhound loped over to see what was doing, and, picking up the Pekingese, proceeded to shake it. The visitor, a mild-looking man, realized that being British he would have to be a hero, as only women and children were near, myself remaining conveniently aloof, as all objective artists should be. Accordingly, he grabbed the hind legs of the wolfhound, which, thus suspended, continued to shake the Pekingese until the little dog dropped off. And then, suddenly, a situation of the gravest peril. There the fellow was, holding that great snarling brute by the hind legs, fortunately with its back towards his front, while his arms sagged gradually, and the jaws of the angry animal clashed nearer and nearer his knees. And while he was thus engaged, the Pekingese, Fluff snuffling up behind him, retook its hold on his trousers. What could the hero do? What could I, no hero, do? I hitched up my trousers, and tying the string tight around my middle, prepared for action. Swallowing the saliva in my mouth, I advanced upon the struggle. I felt courage coming into my stomach, empty but for a rind of stale cheese and an old piece of bread. Food in those days was generally scorned as an unspiritual thing. Meanwhile, the real hero had walked into the sea. The Alsatian, no hydrophile, quit at the first breaker, but the Pekingese was nearly drowned before it let go. Bravo, I thought. He is another Solomon. I was wrong. Hardly had the hero waded on shore again than he was attacked by an hysterical woman who was nursing the Pekingese in her arms. Solomon then proceeded to get it back from both plaintiffs at once, for while the Pekingese owner was describing him to himself in terms of herself, the owner of the wolfhound was shouting at him. A, it was a valuable animal he had been injuring. B, it was not British to be cruel to animals, and C, he deserved flogging. That night I heard the hero, over his fourth glass of whisky, explaining the ironies of his predicament that morning, for the Pekingese apparently belonged to his mother-in-law. "Ah, there's all sorts about nowadays," remarked Charlie noncommittally, as he leaned over the bar beside his pint of beer and rum and spat past a customer's ear into a cuspidor. After a while, the visitor asked about the heads of animals on the wall behind the bar. There were 4 of them, close together, greasy-looking objects, stained by years of fug and tobacco smoke. Fixed to a piece of wood by the neck, the dead and stuffed existed among various knives. 2 of the heads had once belonged to badgers. A year or 2 back, Charlie used to go badger digging with his famous terrier, the Mad Mullah. The other 2 were un-British. "That's him. That's the Mullah," remarked Charlie, pointing at the dingy old dog sniffing at the visitor's trousers. "Get away, Mullah." The old dog took no notice, but continued to sniff without emotion and almost without movement. "He's old now, the Mullah," went on Charlie musingly. "He don't take the slightest notice of what I tells him. He's slow and don't care no more, see? But when he had his teeth, Mullah'd tackle the biggest Boer badger, and when once he'd got a holt on any brock, Mullah'd hang on. Aye, he'd hang on for a pastime. Not like other terriers, all barking and fuss, but well away from a badger, no my. Mullah'd be right up facing the badger, yes me." "Would he ever fight other dogs in the village?" inquired that morning's hero of the sands. "Not unless another dog tackled him first," replied Charlie. "But no dog would interfere with the Mullah in they days. They knew him too well, see." As often happens, dog and master seemed to share the same temperament. Both were undemonstrative, loyal, easy-going, but awkward customers if roused. And yet, such is the paradox of life on occasion, I was to observe on the following morning certain behaviour of Charlie and his dog in the street outside my cottage, which was contrary to what I had observed about him heretofore. There was a gaunt, somewhat argumentative and awkward old farmer who lived opposite my cottage, nicknamed Stroil George. He was going downhill. He had only his grown-up daughter to help him. His rented arable fields were foul with weed, particularly of couch grass, locally called stroil. As Charlie was walking down the street with the old terrier, Mad Muller, Stroil George came out of his yard, followed by Roy, his cattle dog. Roy was a timid dog, afraid of lightning and thunder. I had observed this recently during a sudden storm. "The rain came down like aught out of a sieve," Stroil George had said to me, "and the bloody dog cleared at the first clap." Stroil George usually spoke as he ploughed. He drove the straightest of furrows. He was a master worker, but his argumentative tongue, working so hard against the irregularities of others, had been his ruin. He thought too much. His speech was simple, direct, and with the least use of words. Thin, cantankerous, and poor, he spent most of his time arguing, protesting, declaiming against the obvious faults and deficiencies of others. And since men impose on their dog or dogs, Roy was a bit of a nervous wreck. When I saw the farmer and the publican approaching one another, and the farmer's dog dodging behind his master when it saw the Mad Muller, I got up from my desk and watched from the window, for it looked to be interesting. Roy, the timid but handsome cattle dog, had been afraid of the Muller for several years. Shouted at by his master since puppyhood, Roy was usually hysterically responsive to a friendly word. He was uncertain, afraid of his neighbours. Roy's mother had been the same. She was the successor to an old dog which Stroil George had shot, and the bitch had witnessed the shooting. She appeared to me to have a semi-human intelligence. She used to send waves of semi-human appeal to me with her eyes as she showed her teeth in nervous grins and wriggled her belly on the ground, often rolling over before me in subjection. Many of her puppies of mixed breed had been drowned. Eventually, Stroil George gave her away, keeping one of her dog pups, who grew up to be the handsome Roy, afraid of lightning, thunder, the report of a gun, and many other things, including the Mad Muller. Nowadays, the Muller, slow and aged, was as inoffensive as he was independent. He lay about in the road, scratching and biting his coat, sleeping in the sun on his side. Wheels of passing motor cars whizzed a few inches from his head. He did not trouble. Sometimes a car, hooting and with squealing brakes, stopped just short of him, when the Muller would raise his grey, scarred head, give a glance, sigh, and settle down to sleep again. "He'll be runned over one day," Charlie used to explain. "I've told him again and again not to lie in the road, but he goes his own way. I can't help it. It makes no odds what I tells him, he don't trouble." Both man and terrier went their own ways. Both were fearless and independent. They shared the same spirit, accepted the same world, the same kind of living. Charlie may have thought that he took the Muller for a walk on fine mornings, but it might have been that the Muller was taking Charlie for a walk for the sake of old times. That is how it appeared to me as the two shuffled down the street, looking slowly about them, each sufficient to himself. On this morning, Charlie carried his old muzzle loader, for he was going to try for a rabbit on a little splat of land he had recently bought. As they came down the street, the yard door of Hole Farm opened, and Stroil George came out, Roy prancing around the near ragged figure of his master. Then Roy, aware of the Muller, slipped with wolf-like lope behind Charlie and let out a sharp, querulous bark. The Muller turned and looked at Roy over his shoulder. Roy, still loping, ran round again behind his master. The Muller trotted after him, slowly but straight at him. Roy started to lope away, glancing back fearfully at the older dog, following him slowly. Round and round the two men the almost leisurely procession went, until Roy, with another sudden sharp bark, turned and gripped the mullah across the neck and shook him slightly. "Ah!" cried Stroil George. "Roy! Ah, you!" With a nervous glance at his master, Roy began to lope around his wide orbit again. The mullah followed quietly, almost leisurely. "He's got no teeth, you know," said Charlie, surprisingly gentle to the other man. "He can't do naught, but he's game. Yes, me, he's game." "Ah, you heller!" growled Stroil George, for Roy had turned and gripped the mullah across the neck again and worried him a moment before turning away. As before, the mullah followed the big cattle dog. "He won't leave him now," remarked Charlie in his reedy conversational voice. "The mullah fights for pastime, you see. One day he'll be killed. He's got no teeth, you see. I tells him so often, but he don't trouble Numui." Charlie spat to disclaim further responsibility. Round and round the two men went the slow lope and trot, Roy glancing first at his master, then at the old terrier. "Roy don't want to fight, you know," said Stroil George. "He could kill un sure enough and knoweth it, but he's afeard all the same." "Mullah ban't afraid of naught," said Charlie shortly. "Mullah! Mullah! Come here, you bad old jack, you!" For the mullah had rushed at Roy and nipped him in the loose skin below the eye. He lost the grip immediately in his toothless gums. "Only brown stumps, you see," repeated Charlie in his quiet little reedy voice. "No teeth, you know. One day he'll be killed, I knows it. I told un too. Mullah!" The mullah ignored his master. He was going to get Roy. "Darn the dog!" shouted Stroil George. "Roy! Ah, you bothersome bugger, you!" There was Roy, after another light worry, followed by the mullah, who, without expression on his grey, scarred face, trotted after him as though he were going to look at an indifferent bone hidden some distance away. Suddenly Stroil George roared out, "Get home!" And Roy, after a glance at the mullah, got home. He slipped through the stream hole in the wall above the culvert which took the stream beside Hole Farm. "Mullah! Mullah!" yelled Charlie in his old Cardiff Docks fish-porter voice, but uselessly, for the terrier, heedless of his master, likewise vanished down the hole. A minute later, having run on his long legs down the bed of the stream beside the farmhouse, through the orchard and so into the yard, Roy appeared on the stone wall higher up the lane, beside the dwarf furze bush which had been trying to grow there for a score of years. Easily he leapt down and trotted to stand by his master. A minute or so later the door of Hole Farm opened, and the voice of the farmer's daughter yelled, "Get home! Out of it, you mangy old flea-bag!" And a broom was used to impel the mullah over the threshold. "God darn the girl!" cried Stroil George. "You've set one on t'other again." "I didn't know," protested the daughter. "Mullah comes sniffing about the place, cocking his leg in my dairy, and I ain't standing for that." The door slammed. The dogs were revolving once more. Roy's tail was between his legs, and his backward glance more frequent. He showed his teeth. His was the weak spirit goaded, like the spirit of a former timid, peace-loving villager who once lived in the cottage I was occupying now. Goaded, they said in the village, bullied by the policeman for months, suddenly the cobbler seized a billhook and killed his tormentor, to die of grief the night before he was to have been hanged. But who in the orbit of pads and tails and hanging tongues was goading who this fine morning? The mullah, that old toothless badger dog, was enjoying himself by the light in his eyes, until abruptly he found himself on his back, while the powerful jaws of the hysterical Roy were mumbling about his throat. Did the mullah's owner, well known for his rages at times, raise his gun and shoot Roy? Did he curse Roy and Roy's owner? Charlie had been a bold fighter with fists in his day. In his bar, too, he could use a rough tongue at times, liable to order you outside if he didn't like your face, or if you put your foot on one of the benches within the dark little room. How would Charlie react to the murder of his old pet? I was amazed to see that he remained in his detached, almost nonchalant posture, deliberately giving every freedom of action to the farmer, all side whiskers and gaunt, peering nose. Stroil George raised his stick, shouting at his dog, and Roy sprang back, still yelping hysterically, and ran once again down the stream-hole. Muller slowly picked himself up, shook himself, then followed leisurely after the cattle dog. "I said it," remarked Charlie in his twittering Finch voice, addressing the sky as he leaned an elbow on the wall. "Muller won't give in." "My dog won't always be so nervous of him, you know." Charlie spat. "Well, I told him. I can't do no more." I waited, watching the furze bush. No shaggy dog suddenly appeared on the skyline. The farmhouse door opened. A voice cried out, "Roy and Muller have gone down the stream to Cried Sands, I reckon," and the door was slammed again. "Well," said Charlie, "Muller'll be back when he comes." And after a few more amiable words with the farmer, he slung his gun on his shoulder and went back up the road, his morning walk over. About an hour later, Roy was seen trotting through Cried village, and a long way after him came the Muller. It is possible that Roy had forgotten the Muller, or rather that the Muller's image was now obscured behind Roy's mental pictures of seaweed pools and cake-owning summer visitors. The moon was almost at the full, and the spring tides left the rocky pools of Down End exposed for a long way at midday. Now Roy, who was usually so faithful and vigilant to attend the farmer and his daughter, who waited to be of use for cows in the street outside the farm every day, occasionally deserted his watch and went down to the bay when the moon was full in summer. It was his habit then to attach himself to any party with bare legs and prawning nets and sandwiches, to keep with them faithfully for a couple of days or so, then to return after his holiday to the village. During such excursions I had sometimes watched Roy standing on the rocks, looking down with great interest at one or another of his temporary friends, prodding with gaffs into clefts and holes, and pushing nets under the seaweed fringe of pools. This must have been in his mind that day, for Roy was observed trotting through the barley field and across the sandy burrows beside the stream, which eventually cut through a gap in the sand-hills and splayed out upon the shore. Arriving there, Roy sniffed at the strong and varied scents in the jetsam of the tide-line, before starting to cross the shore in the direction of the black ridges of rocks below Down End. On his way there he crossed an interesting scent. Following this, up and down the sands, at length he came to a diminutive dog being led by a stout woman. "Grr! Get away, you brute!" cried the woman, and picked up the Pekingese. "Don't be upset by the nasty dog, Consuelo, darling. Mummy won't let it hurt you. Grr! Go away at once, you horrid brute! The impertinence!" The brute, however, was obviously attractive to Consuelo, and panting with excitement, she managed to scramble out of her barreline owner's arms. Galloping away, Consuelo reached the handsome Roy, and then, turning her back to him, she stared at the sea in a provoking attitude. Roy, however, had seen some prawners on the rocks. As though ridding his pads of the scents of the old world, he kicked up a certain amount of sand with his hind feet, and then loped away, followed by the galloping Pekingese, dragging her lead, heedless of her owner's entreaties, through the wet delta of the stream in the sands. Roy's mind was set on lobsters and crabs, which terrified and therefore absorbed him. He loped straight for the rocks. As he was nearing the first ridge, having outrun the unattractive little dog, he heard a familiar sound, and turning round he saw the Pekingese being attacked by a big dog. Naturally, Roy had to return to see what was happening, but the grey apparition of the Alsatian made him afraid, so that he ran backwards and forwards, shifting always to be behind the big dog, while yelping and making other hysterical noises. Then the mad mullah, who had been following Roy's scent, appeared on the sands. He trotted towards the grey, hackled Alsatian as casually as though he were going into the kitchen of the lower house for his dinner. Trotting directly up to the Alsatian, the mullah bit the wolfhound in the loose skin of the jaws. At once the Alsatian flung the Pekingese away, and springing upon the mullah, bit him in the shoulder and began to shake him. Neither dog made any sound, either of growling or yelping. Both dogs were killers. The Alsatian worried the smaller terrier in the furious silence of killing. Roy had been throwing up his head and uttering shrill howls, but the silence of the deadly struggle seemed to change hysteria into strength. With hackles raised, he ran at the Alsatian and bit him across the neck. Several visitors were warily approaching, including the husband of the owner of the Pekingese, yesterday's hero of the sands, who was being urged by his wife to do something. Mothers were exhorting their children to keep back. 2 men dared to approach and to thwack the Alsatian with their children's spades, while one boy had already thrown in vain his friend's model yacht, while the friend was scooping up pailfuls of sand to throw at the dogs from afar. "Go on, do something!" cried the owner of the Pekingese. Roy seemed to be fighting silently, locked to the wolfhound's jowl. A power seemed to be upon him, for he swung the grey dog about as though he were no heavier than the mullah. One of the men who had vainly tried to stop the fight with the child's spade was the owner of the Alsatian. The fellow now appeared with his wife's sunshade open, which he prodded and spun in the faces of the writhing dogs. All that happened was the sunshade got slightly buckled, but bravely he persisted, possibly seeing himself in the role of bullfighter in a position of great danger, but to the onlookers he was merely funny as he cavorted about just this side of danger. Like a wrestler, Roy swung the wolfhound, trying to put his enemy on its back. The mullah had no interest in the fight. He stood some distance away with drooping head, shivering, as though dazed by the realization of what had happened to him. Grey and tired, he limped away homewards. Meanwhile, the hero, who the day before had held up the Alsatian by its hind legs, now had got hold of those legs again, after shouting to the parasol flutterer to get hold of the other dog by its hind legs. The 2 dogs held grimly to their bites upon one another's neck-skin as their legs were drawn out. "Now," said the hero of the sands, "will someone light a newspaper and just bring it near their noses, please?" This was done. Flames of the Daily Whale separated the heads, whereupon the Alsatian turned and ran away in great, long, determined strides towards the baggy side of the bay. As for Roy, he was making friends with everyone, looking up into many human eyes and panting happily, a new 4-legged hero of the sands. "You wouldn't do what I told you, would you?" jeered Charlie to his dog, blinking on the mat by the kitchen fire that afternoon. "You thought you knew better, didn't you, eh? And let me tell you again, you obstinate old toad, you'll get runned over if you continue to lie in the road. And you leave Roy alone in the future, will you?" The mullah swelled, and slowly he sighed. His wounds were yellow with iodine. The very next day he was lying in the road again, on his side, and Charlie was lounging against his doorpost when Stroil George came up with his cows, followed by Roy. Charlie noticed that Roy was making as if to dodge behind the farmer when he saw the mullah. He watched him hesitate. Then, swiftly and silently, as the old dog's head was raised, Roy bounded forward with feathery tail and lightly touched nose to nose with the mullah. The mullah's head sank again. He swelled for a sigh of contentment, and with a joyous bark, Roy leapt around his master. From first to last, the behaviour of both men and dogs had seemed to me to be wonderful. Incidents of an Afternoon Walk. This author's aim in writing has always been to recreate or bring to life again in paper through print the life around him as he has seen and heard it. Never merely to write a beautiful style, or to make a perfect form for its own sake. Here is the world, always with awareness that it is but one man's limited world, and here is that which is to be seen, heard, and occasionally to be smelled and tasted. Take it or leave it, that is up to the reader. The writer cannot do better than try to bring some of the life he has known to paper. As for the dialogue, or the way people speak, well, he tries to reproduce the manner of speaking and the words. Sometimes fortune smiles on him. Thus, the following dialogue occurred in a Devon court of summary jurisdiction, and was reported in a local paper. Someone had summoned a neighbour suspected of getting rid of that someone's noisy dog. Cross-examination of defendant by the plaintiff's solicitor. "What did the dog die of?" "I died of a Friday, sir." "Yes, but how did he die?" "On his back, sir." "Yes, but what made him die?" "His heart gived out, sir." Yes, but how did he come by his death?" "I didn't come to it, sir, it come to he." Yes, my good man, but what was the complaint?" "There wasn't never no complaint, sir. The neighbours was all satisfied." That, of course, is a gift. But such repartee and wit is not rare if one listens in the right places. Local speaking is usually good because it arises directly off work or action. I have only to listen to a neighbour of mine on this hilltop to hear graphic English which derives from the living scenery of that energetic smallholder's world. One afternoon, upon setting out for a walk, I saw in the sunken lane outside my gate a bramble-torn cap covering the shaggy hair of my neighbour. He was speaking to another farmer on the subject of what the Ministry of Agriculture called rodent control. "Aye, there be a lot of bloody rats about the fields now. In a month or two the buggers will be down in the barns and stacks. Hundreds and thousands of the bloody things. Why, t'other night I stood by the gate up along, and if one bloody rat rinned over me boots, why, I tell 'ee, me dear, there was bloody thousands. I kept still. I had me gun too. I could have shot a score with each barrel, but I knew if I so much as kecked one of the buggers with me boot, t'others would have mobilised me. I tell 'ee, the government should do something about rats. They'm all for taking your money, but what about ridding us of rats? Last winter I took 93 of the buggers one morning out of my gins tilled in one veal. 93! Then there was thousands of the bloody critters left in the rabbits' burries. Aye, thousands and thousands. But still I couldn't keep no eggs or chickens or chicken food. They ate the bloody lot. Fast as I'd trap a couple of hundred, they'd spring up again. One night, I tell 'ee, my dear, listen to this, I heard a bloody great galloping about on the ceiling over me head, and me missus said to me, it be like a cart and horse passing overhead. Whatever can it be, Jack? I said, 'tis a bloody rats up over. I couldn't get a wink of sleep all night. Back and forth the buggers was proper bloodin' galloping, like a bloody aerial derby it was up there. Aye, but I'll tell 'ee what I did. I tilled a gin for the buggers, but couldn't catch naught. One day, though, I cornered one behind the cupboard, and a bloody girt stag rat 'twas, jimmering and chammering at me, clinging to the bloody wall, just out of reach of my bloody stick it was, and one bloody cat on the top of the cupboard, and neither on the shelf, and a couple of bloody dogs waiting below. I kept the bugger pressed there again the bloody wall with me stick. I warn't going for leaving now I gotten, not if I stayed there all bloody night, and the cat and the bloody dogs biding there too. Missus fetched a long stick, but the bloody thing was bent and wouldn't titch the stag rat. which opened its mouth and showed its bloody teeth to me, and jimmering and chammering it was, with the bloody cats howling up above and the dogs a-roaring and a-bawling down below, and me yelling at the missus to yet the bloody poker in the fire. I'd burn the bugger out if it wouldn't come out, cruelty or no cruelty. Of course I knowed if one of the inspectors for the abolition of cruelty in animals was to have comed along, I should have been into town. But what about cruelty of the bloody rats to me, unable to get a wink of sleep with them trotting about overhead like a bloody horse race? So missus yet up the poker, and I pressing into the rat, saying, "Burn, you bugger, burn!" And God darn, the withering thing burst into flames and ran down the wall, and not a bloody dog would touch it. Lucky the door was shut, else 'twould have rinned out and maybe set fire to me neighbour's ricks, for 'twas the self-same bloody rat I had tarred. I suppose the other rats had droven because of the smell, and the bugger had come into my place. I tell 'ee there's hundreds and thousands of rats in the fields today. The ragged cap was lifted and the shaggy scalp scraped by broken nails. Then the conversation, or monologue, continued in the same language, the trapper telling the identical story again, word for word, laugh for laugh, in the traditional Devon manner. Having taken this in, I set out on my walk. I crossed several fields, climbing over stone and earth banks, always on the lookout for a bull, for it was cattle country. I followed a small runner grown with watercress and brook lime, which led eventually to a pond. This little bit of water was a favourite place to visit, for I was always hoping to see a trout there, not to kill, but to feel it being alive. The stream which fed the pond was hardly more than a trickle, scarcely more than a yard in width and 6 or 7 inches deep, but it was pure water, eventually joining the stream passing through Cryde village, which was reputed to hold the biggest fish in Devon, owing to its teeming insect life. I ought to say that this was before the motor car generally opened up the place, with consequent increase of summer visitors and the stream's inevitable pollution. The little pond was triangular and silted. It lay in the corner of the field, holding a few thousand gallons dammed by a stone wall. The water worked a grist mill in the farm behind the manor house 300 paces below. It was a haunt of moorfowl and other water birds. As I came down the slope of the field, I saw a heron standing at its muddy edge. The tall grey bird flapped away when I was 4 or 5 gunshots distant. Not that I carried a gun, but herons knew the habits of men, and taking no chances, they were up and away usually when well out of range. Seeing me, the heron jumped, its broad grey wings scooping the air, but it was caught by the wind as it tried to rise and could make no headway, so it turned down the wind and was carried in a long glide over the next field, where it swung round again and alighted among the rough grass clumps and the thistles. I could see the head on the long neck held up anxiously to watch me away when it would return to its feeding. The mud under the broken turf had been made arrowy by its feet, as the bird had stalked from the pond's apex to the deeper water by the stone dam. After every dozen steps it had turned to peer into the pond, and at these stances the mud was much trodden. The heron had taken many steps forward to snick its prey out of the water. What had attracted it? I could see nothing. I sat down and waited. Wind ruffled the pond surface. Wavelets lapped the margin, erasing and silting the arrowy footmarks. Very soon, from the direction of the wooden fender, came a noise like a duck quietly calling her ducklings, but it was a drier, more brittle noise. A similar cry came from the bank, and then another. A chorus broke out over the pond. I saw a rat running along with a frog in its mouth. It went into a hole in the bank, continuing the stone dam. There was a well-trodden track leading into this hole, 2 inches wide, the path of the rats. One of the colony must have come out as the heron flew up, and seeing a frog on the bank, picked it up. Many frogs were now apparent in the pond. Most of them were bullfrogs, smaller than the females. The glitter of the sun and the lessening cold had excited them to begin the search and struggle for mates. All things in nature have their seasons, and the males usually await the females. It is so with the bullfrog, which, finding a female, makes sure of her by climbing upon her broad back and clinging there in the attitude of a jockey at the gallop. A female walked out of the water as I watched, and the movement drew 4 unattached bullfrogs. She was mounted by the quickest, but carried him 6 inches only before the other frogs began to muscle in on his racket. I am sorry if this American slang phrase hurts the reader's susceptibilities, but I am no stylistic writer. I repeat, my aim is always to convey to the reader what my eyesight puts into my brain. The frogs were muscular creatures. They made a racket or noise. They were competitive, pitiless, entirely selfish. The phrase, therefore, is used, although it belongs to the gangsters of the USA, who have probably never heard of the little pond behind the hamlet of Putsborough in North Devon. At least not until the book appears in the penitentiary libraries. The jockey was prepared for Mustlers Inn. With a slow but well-judged shove with his off hind foot, he laid one on its back. Then he croaked, as though trying to get his mount to start again. She carried him forward another 3 inches and stopped. He dug his hands deeper under her armpits, urging her on with calf and spur. She remained motionless. A rival, greener than the jockey, climbed leisurely up, avoiding the thrust of elastic hind legs, and digging his arms in, the green rival bent his head forward and slowly arched his back in an attempt to unseat the jockey. Their stifled croaking stirred to movement the 3 other frogs who had been squatting behind them. These would-be jockeys hopped forward to receive immediate thrusts of feet in their faces. 2 of them overturned. They got upright again and squatted still as though in oblivion. The greener frog who had scrambled up was now trying to throttle the jockey. The 3 fingers and thumb of each hand were clenched with his striving. In other words, he was muscling in. For nearly a minute the muscling in continued. Then the female decided to move. She took 2 heavy hops forward. The squeaky cries of the jockeys began again. The 3 also-rams moved after them. 2 of them collided, and as though in despair, one hopped astride the other. He was carried forward a few inches, but dismounted and turned back. The movement of my foot had drawn him. He leapt at the toe of my shoe, fell off, and went back disconsolately towards the water, passing another aspirant who was hurrying forward, gay with a bit of weed round its neck.